paying their respects. President Donald Trump and First Lady Melania Trump remember the late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. The next steps. Our team coverage looks at how the White House and senators on both sides of the aisle are preparing for a battle over the president's nominee. Feeling better. An update on Cardinal Tagle, diagnosed earlier this month with COVID-19. And yes to life. Pope Francis gives his blessing to an initiative in Poland to defend the unborn. On EWTN News Nightly for Thursday, September 24th, 2020. President Donald Trump gets booed while paying respects to the late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Good evening and thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Tracy Sable. The late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg will lie in state at the Capitol building tomorrow, the first woman to do so. Meantime, President Donald Trump is just 2 days away from naming his nominee to the High Court. It comes amid more unrest across the nation after a decision by the Kentucky grand jury. White House correspondent Owen Jensen reports. Owen?
Tracy, as the race for the White House heats up, President Trump and First Lady Melania Trump paid their respects to Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg this morning. And as the president prepares to announce his new nominee, he's dealing with a fresh round of violence in American cities.
This afternoon, White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany, when asked by reporters what President Donald Trump's message is to the family of Breonna Taylor.
That our hearts go out to her. It was a horrible tragedy that happened, and that our hearts also are with the 2 police officers who were shot last night in the Louisville riots.
In Louisville, Kentucky, more than 100 arrests after violent protests. A grand jury's decision to not indict officers in the shooting of Breonna Taylor. 2 police officers were shot but are expected to recover. A 26-year-old man is charged with opening fire on those officers. President Trump tweeting, praying for the 2 police officers that were shot. And Joe Biden tweeting, Jill and I are keeping the officers shot in Louisville in our prayers. Meanwhile, President Trump and First Lady Melania Trump pay their respects to Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But even that solemn occasion met with loud chants and booing by some spectators. And on the campaign trail, the Joe Biden campaign keeps hitting President Trump on the pandemic hard. One ad comparing mass casualty events. Just last night, the president announced more progress on the vaccine front and plans for getting it out fast.
Johnson & Johnson announced that their vaccine candidate has reached the final stage of clinical trials. This is record time. We are awarding $200 million of CARES Act funding to all 50 states to prepare to distribute the vaccine to high-risk residents.
Now, many other cities across the nation saw protests as well, and a new AP survey shows that support is falling for demonstrations against systemic racism. That survey was done before the Louisville situation. And finally, President Trump is in North Carolina talking health care tonight, and then he'll be in Florida after that at a rally. Tracy?
Okay, thank you so much, Owen. White House correspondent Owen Jensen reporting for us tonight. With 2 days to go before President Trump announces his nominee to the Supreme Court, Republicans and Democrats are not letting the suspense stop them from commenting in support or in criticism of whomever is picked. Capitol Hill correspondent Eric Rosales reports.
Catholic Amy Coney Barrett is still the name heard most frequently up here on Capitol Hill as the possible next U.S. Supreme Court nominee. The respected federal circuit court judge is being championed by Republicans, while Democrats are taking steps to signal that any nominee at this time is illegitimate.
Why go to such great lengths to ram through a justice mere weeks before an election, making a complete mockery of their previous position? Because this is the only way for Republicans to achieve their radical right-wing agenda.
Every time in 45 years, Madam President, that a Republican president has nominated someone to the Supreme Court, the exact same set of clenched horror stories are wheeled out
The Senate leaders drawing battle lines in the sand over voting on a nominee to be the next U.S. Supreme Court justice. In the halls of Congress today, Judiciary Committee ranking member Senator Dianne Feinstein wouldn't stop to talk to me about the potential nominee.
I'm sorry.
Her fellow Democrat, Senator Mazie Hirono, tweeted last night, quote, "Republicans are racing to put a justice on the Supreme Court." But moderate Democrat Senator Joe Manchin tells me he will meet with the nominee.
That's part of my responsibility, meet and confer. So I've never been asked, but I've never turned down anybody.
And he may not have much longer to wait.
We're already working on the schedule. We'll be one, as a member of the judiciary, we'll be one of the first ones to get an opportunity to meet face to face.
Senator Tom Tillis of North Carolina tells me he is bracing for the confirmation hearing.
I think that the Kavanaugh hearing is going to look like a pep rally compared to what we're going to see.
Lots of support from Republican senators up here at Capitol Hill who tell me that they're going to move at all deliberate speed to get this nominee confirmed. They say it's important for the full bench of 9 justices be seated before Election Day. At the Capitol, Eric Rosales, EWTN News Nightly.
Joining me now on Skype is Amy Howe, co-founder of SCOTUS Blog. Amy, welcome back. Good to see you again. We won't know until Saturday who the nominee will be. That said, how do you think the president's selection will impact the makeup of the High Court?
It's likely to be very significant. Justice Ginsburg was one of the most reliably consistent liberal votes on the court for the last 27 years. And we don't know, as you said, who he's likely to nominate to replace her, but it's going to be much more whoever she is going to be much more conservative than Justice Ginsburg, and will almost certainly shift the court to the right.
Amy, what effect do you think that will have on cases before the court, cases such as the Affordable Care Act or cases on abortion?
It's hard to say with the Affordable Care Act. There are a couple of issues in the Affordable Care Act. One is whether or not the individual mandate, the requirement to buy health insurance, is constitutional now that the penalty for not getting health insurance is zero. This was the issue back in 2012. But for a lot of people, I think the real issue is what happens if the Supreme Court says that it's not. And the Chief Justice John Roberts and Justice Brett Kavanaugh have both suggested in the past year or so that there's a strong presumption that even if one part of a law is unconstitutional, that you shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, that the rest of the law should normally still be constitutional. So even if the court does agree that the mandate is unconstitutional, it could very well be that the rest of the law still survives. No matter who the president nominates to replace Justice Ginsburg.
The front runner appears to be Judge Amy Coney Barrett. Been hearing her name a lot. She has been considered before. What are your thoughts on her as a possible replacement?
So she is, obviously extremely well qualified. I think she's certainly someone who would have a lot of support from religious conservatives. Back when she was nominated for the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit, she was under fire from a lot of Democratic senators at her Senate confirmation hearing. Senator Dianne Feinstein of California sort of pressed her on the extent to which her Catholic faith might affect her judging. She said, the dogma lives loudly within you. And it may well have had the opposite effect and helped to make her a front runner for the position. But I think she's widely regarded. When she was nominated for the Seventh Circuit, everyone on the faculty at Notre Dame, where she was a law professor for 15 years, signed a letter supporting her nomination. So she's conservative, very smart, very well liked.
Amy, as you know, Democrats have been critical of the speed of this process to fill Justice Ginsburg's seat before the November election. Do you think it's possible that the confirmation process could be completed by then?
So it's a really interesting question. Obviously, it could theoretically, it would be much faster than the confirmation process in the past. The average speed since I think 1975 for confirmations has been about 70 days. Justice Ginsburg took 50 days. Justice Neil Gorsuch, which may be the best example because he was nominated shortly after the president took office back in 2017, and when there was an open seat after the death of Justice Scalia, took 66 days. If the president nominates someone on Saturday, as he's announced he will, there'd be 38 days until Election Day, so it would be much faster than normal. That certainly is not.
Amy, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Amy, thank you so much. And thanks so much for your time. We appreciate it. Amy Howe, co-founder of SCOTUS blog. Faith leaders in Quebec, Canada are speaking out against new restrictions spurred by the coronavirus pandemic. This week, government officials limited attendance at indoor religious services to no more than 50 people. But movie theaters and auditoriums are allowed 250 people. Faith leaders call the plans disappointing and unacceptable. A federal judge heard preliminary arguments yesterday in a case involving the reopening of private schools in New Mexico. The father of a student at a private school says the state is violating the Constitution by setting looser restrictions on in-person attendance, that is, at public schools. The state's Democratic governor defends the plan. The British government is introducing a massive spending program to prevent widespread layoffs as payments to workers end next month.
We are introducing Pay As You Grow. This means loans can now be extended from 6 to 10 years, nearly halving the average monthly repayment.
Britain's Treasury chief also says the government will pay lost wages of up to 2/3 of their working hours for the next 6 months. He also says these are radical interventions that have never been tried before. Coming up, an update on Cardinal Tagle, diagnosed earlier this month with COVID-19. Vatican Cardinal Angelo Becciu resigned today from his job and from the rights extended him as a member of the College of Cardinals. Cardinal Becciu had been connected with an ongoing investigation into financial mismanagement. Until today, he had been in charge of the Holy See's department investigating causes for sainthood. We'll have more on this story as it becomes available. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle has recovered from the coronavirus. The 63-year-old was diagnosed with COVID-19 around 2 weeks ago. Since then, he has remained in isolation in his native Philippines. One Catholic official in Manila called the news a great joy for the whole church. Cardinal Tagle spends most of his time in Rome, where he is the head of the Vatican's evangelization congregation. Joining us now is Edward Pentin, Rome correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register. And always good to see you. Thanks so much for coming on. What can you tell us about Cardinal Tagle's diagnosis and his recovery?
Well, he was diagnosed, Tracy, on the 10th of September. He was diagnosed as having the coronavirus on his way actually to Manila from Rome. But he's been since the last day or two, he's been tested negative. So he's okay. He's never shown any symptoms of it. He's been asymptomatic. But as a precautionary measure, they placed him in quarantine for the last 2 weeks. But he's okay. He's the first senior curial official, head of a dicastery to actually contract the virus.
You mentioned that he's going to be in quarantine for a while. Do you know anything else as far as what comes next for him?
We don't. I think he'll probably come back here as soon as he can. His job, of course, is prefect to the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples, which is basically in charge of all the missions around the world. It's a very important job. The rector of the Pontifical Philippine College actually said this is a sign that God wants him to continue that work. So it's very likely, of course, that he'll come back and he'll carry on doing this job. He's also considered by some to be a leading papal contender, so that's also significant in this case. But he seems to be very well, and surviving this quite well. And he's 63, so he's relatively young.
Ed, can you update us on the current situation regarding COVID there in Rome, the Vatican, and in Italy in general?
Yes, well, Italy's being praised by a lot of media reports at the moment as being an example of how to deal with the second wave of the coronavirus. They seem to be doing pretty well, relatively. There've been 1,640 new cases over the last 24 hours. 20 new deaths, which is a far cry from what it was in March, which was 909 at the peak. 919 at the peak. So it's actually they seem to be coping pretty well. There's 46,000 cases altogether, but as I say, it's much less than it was 6 months ago or so.
How has the church been handling the situation?
Well, the church has been very much sort of continuing to sort of take the government's lead in the directions of how they should actually deal with this crisis. They obviously shut down a lot of the churches when the lockdown was enforced up until mid-June. But they've also continued to cut back on masses here in Rome, at least. They've been cutting back on those. Certain churches remain largely closed. Not all of them, of course. Most of them are open now. But there has been that measure that's been taken. And across Italy, I think something like 90% of churches now make it compulsory to receive communion in the hand, which is quite a controversial measure for various different reasons. And so they've rather continued to be very strict regarding these rules and enforcing them. How that goes forward, we don't know. Obviously, everyone's hoping that the second wave won't be as serious as the first, and certainly the signs are that that's not the case, and that there'll be a certain amount of freedom going forward regarding divine worship in Rome and in Italy in general.
Well, Ed, thanks so much for your time. We always appreciate you coming on. Edward Pentin, Rome correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register. Thanks again, Ed.
Thank you, Tracy.
A cardinal from the Netherlands is warning about the dangers of assisted suicide. Cardinal Willem Ajax says once euthanasia is legalized, safeguards against it are abandoned. He says lawmakers in his country are considering a measure to allow assisted suicide for people who simply believe that their lives have been completed. Hong Kong pro-democracy activist Joshua Wong says that he was arrested again today for participating in an illegal protest last October. Wong spoke to reporters this morning saying that he went to the police station as part of his bail requirement, but was arrested for joining the unauthorized assembly. He says he was also accused of violating a pre-coronavirus pandemic law banning the wearing of masks in public places.
蓬佩奥的有关言论罔顾事实，纯属谎言。
China is accusing U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo of, quote, pure lies for saying that China was aggressively trying to influence state and local governments in the United States. Secretary Pompeo warned yesterday that so-called sister city programs were Chinese overseas propaganda operations. Hundreds more are arrested in Belarus for protesting against President Alexander Lukashenko. Thousands took to the streets in the capital of Minsk and other cities last night. At least 360 people were arrested. 7,000 people have been detained since last month's disputed elections. The protests broke out after Lukashenko held a surprise inauguration yesterday morning. Protesters claimed that he stole the vote. Russian armed forces are continuing their military drills in the southern part of the country. The drills are joint exercises between Moscow and China. Troops from Belarus, Iran, and Pakistan also are taking part. The military exercises are expected to continue until Saturday. Up next, Pope Francis defends the unborn with a message that is clear as a bell. We'll explain. As we reported earlier, demonstrations took place last night in Louisville and across the nation following a Kentucky grand jury's decision to not indict police officers in the fatal shooting of Breonna Taylor. Hundreds of demonstrators chanted Taylor's name and marched in cities including New York and Washington, D.C. Taylor, an emergency medical worker, was shot multiple times by white officers who entered her home during a narcotics investigation 6 months ago. No drugs were found inside. Joining me now on Skype is Archbishop Joseph Kurtz of the Archdiocese of Louisville. Your Excellency, welcome back to the show. We're grateful you're on.
Well, thank you, Tracy. It's good to be with you this evening. Thank you.
Well, as you know, reaction to yesterday's grand jury decision regarding the death of Breonna Taylor has been widespread, with demonstrations across the country and unrest overnight there in Louisville, including the shooting of 2 police officers. What's your message to those who feel that justice wasn't served in this case?
Well, of course, the primary message that we need, I think, all to gather together on is the need for us to be united in opposing the ugly sin of racism, and also to be united in supporting first responders, because we together need to be able to be a community that addresses these very difficult questions. I mourn, as so many do, the tragic death of Breonna Taylor. We also don't have a script to say, well, this is exactly the right steps to take. But I do know this, that as a community, we are going to need to unite in order to together oppose the sin of racism, so that we're not simply furthering division. We certainly need to reject violence as any solution. It simply moves us backwards. But there is a need for us as a church also to step forward. And I think members of our church want to be part of that, ambassadors who are willing to work for peace, but also confront the issues of racism that, as we've said so often, raise their ugly head too often.
Yesterday, you issued a statement in which you spoke about, quote, the nation's original sin of racism, and you just mentioned that with us. Can you talk a little bit more about that and also the effects?
Sure. Well, of course, we don't want to confuse that with our own doctrine of original sin, but it is a common phrase that is being used now in order to talk about the deep-seated nature of racism and the fact that it affects us not simply by what I might say are sins of commission, efforts to actually treat someone with hatred, which of course robs the dignity of both the speaker and the person spoken to, but also, I think, sins of omission, in which we find ourselves not giving opportunities to people. And we see that in all people, but especially in our young people. People should not be denied opportunities because of the color of their skin. We know that respect for human life and what we'll be doing throughout the month of October in respecting human life means in a very concrete way that the person in front of us is the person needed to be treated with dignity. So I think that is exactly, Tracy, what we're talking about, that as Catholics, each of us look for the opportunity to take that first step, not to be uninvolved, but to say, with God's grace, I can make a difference in treating people with the dignity that I want others to treat me with.
Let's talk about the way forward. How do you see that in bringing about healing and racial justice?
Well, you know, there's no substitute for putting a face on any situation. As long as something remains abstract, we can talk about it in a distant way. But of course, we know that efforts being made to reach out to mourn, for example, the tragic death of Breonna Taylor, to pray for her family, but also to look for opportunities that are right within our own circle, being able to reach out to people regardless of the color of their skin, and to be able together to give opportunities for people. We have many such opportunities. Most of our parishes, for example, have people coming of all different ethnic and racial backgrounds, and the need for us to find a way to take that step. It'll be different, of course, for each person, but it might be those with whom you work, for young people going to school, those with whom you're going to school with. And the tried and true approach is pray, educate, and act. So we need together to pray that the racial divides might be narrowed and ended. We need to educate ourselves because there are even unknown biases that we all grow up with. We know that. But we also need to then very prayerfully and carefully find ways to take a step of action. And that can be revealed to us in many ways, and it's really an act of our faith. This is part of our Catholic social teaching, to treat people with great dignity.
Well, Your Excellency, thank you so much for coming on today. We really do appreciate your time. Archbishop Joseph Kurtz of the Archdiocese of Louisville. Thank you again.
Thank you, Tracy.
Tonight on EWTN's Pro-Life Weekly, a U.S. Senator weighs in on whether a Supreme Court nominee should face questions on their religious faith.
The religious beliefs of a nominee need to be respected. They are sacred, and they're none of the Judiciary Committee's darn business. So if they do raise that, they will do so at their own peril.
House Catherine Hadro talks to Republican Senator Mike Lee, a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, about the skirmish ahead and the candidate he thinks is most likely to be nominated. That's tonight on EWTN Pro-Life Weekly at 10 p.m. Eastern. And finally tonight, Pope Francis blesses a bell at the Vatican that will ring out in defense of the unborn. It is called the Voice of the Unborn Bell. Catholics in Poland plan to ring it in defense of the unborn. The Holy Father became the first person to ring the bell at the Vatican yesterday. It will be used in Poland's March for Life, planned for next month in Warsaw. We thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Tracy Sable. Good night and God bless.